All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I am the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and I've recorded more than 5,000 interviews going back to 2003, all of which are available at scotthorton.org. You can also sign up for the podcast feed. The full archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, introducing Danny Sjursen again, regular writer for antiwar.com and a lot of other places too. He wrote the book Ghost Riders of Baghdad and, of course, was in the Iraq Surge and the Afghan Surge, both. And yeah, anyway, welcome back to the show. How you doing, Danny?
I'm great, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, happy to have you here. Hey, listen, would you give us a short rundown of the different places where you are writing these days? We try to publish everything, republish everything, link to everything we can at antiwar.com, but Eric complains that he just can't keep up. We have a deluge of Danny Sjursen pieces constantly, and you're doing more and more radio interviews and this and that kind of thing all over the place too, which is great. But where can people find your writings on a regular basis, sir?
Well, first of all, my website, skepticalvet.com, is a pretty good place just to grab everything that comes in. But, since Truth Dig fell apart, that was my other regular weekly column. I've branched out even more. So monthly, I'm at Tom Dispatch. I'm pretty regular at Popular Resistance, which is kind of picking up some of the Truth Dig mantle. Mother Jones more recently, as well as Common Dreams and other spots. I've really kind of been throwing my work a lot of different places, and I also work with something called the Independent Media Institute, and what they do is, kind of like syndicate in the alt-left circuit, so it's actually difficult to say where stuff's going to show up, but those are sort of my regulars. But if you check out the site, pretty much everything kind of bumps over there, and it's a decent for, it's kind of gathering ground, but it's a busy world, and you know how it works. It's if Jake Tapper won't invite you on, and the New York Times won't hire you, then you kind of piece it all together and get out where you can.
Yep. And yeah, it is a good idea to keep your own site where you republish everything there for safekeeping, because even an institution like Truth Dig might fly by night. And so, by the way, I mean, is the site still up? Did we have your archives, or the whole thing is just gone now, or what?
So the archives are up, and I checked on that actually at Eric from Anti-War's recommendation, because I wrote so much stuff there, including the history book, although that's mid-publication now. But yeah, it's
wait, what about the history? Is what publication now?
Oh yeah, so I wrote that 38-part history of the United States for Truth Dig, based on my lectures at West Point. That'll be publishing with Steerforth Press out of New Hampshire.
Awesome.
Early next year. So yeah, I've already contracted for that. We're kind of in the editing right now, but luckily the editing won't be hopefully as bad as it is for most books, especially since this one's going to be like 700 pages, because it went through that pretty extensive editing with Tom Caswell over at Truth Dig, who's kind of like, been in the business forever. So, great. But yeah, that's coming out. But the Truth Dig stuff is still up. But when you click on the site, it says like that they're on a hiatus. But the truth is that we all got pink slipped with no notice, even those of us who didn't sign on to the work dispute or the labor dispute. And so it's funny how sometimes a proprietor of a liberal progressive site doesn't necessarily live out some of those values when it comes to business. But that's a whole other issue. And people like Chris Hedges are better to speak to that because they were more involved. But it's been drama, of course.
Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, I'm glad to know that your archives are there, and I'm really happy to hear that you're making a book out of that history series. That was really great stuff. So, and sorry, my levels, everybody. It's this new board. It's got no compression on it and no insert hole for my compressor. So the volume, I'm mad at the way it's working. Anyway, see, it's way up in the red, or it's way too quiet. God dang thing. Anyway, so I should ask you about, there's so many different articles you've written lately, but I want to focus on Afghanistan, this thing that you wrote for antiwar.com about Cigar, the boys who cry about actual wolves. And so as I mentioned, you know a thing or two about the Afghan War, having helped lose it. So, and I just love in here the way you get into the parallels with Obama and Gorbachev and all that. But first of all, tell people about Cigar and, what you're talking about, 47th time's a charm and all of this in here.
Yeah, I mean, I've been writing about Cigar for a while. So, Cigar is the special inspector general for Afghan reconstruction. And around the time Obama was coming to office, in '08, sort of like the last quarter of '08, Congress mandated the creation of this. And, they were supposed to look into like fraud, waste, and abuse and, investigate themselves. It's always great when the government investigates itself. I mean, in practice, the concept's not the worst one, in terms of what the war in Afghanistan has been about and how, we've been lied to. So the interesting thing about Cigar is that, look, they're they're owned by the government, whether they say they're independent or not, right? So they're polite and their language is Washingtonian. But if you read the reports, and I'm a geek and I read rather quickly, so I've read most of them over the last at least 2 years, they actually have a lot of truth in them, and they do raise some alarm. And recently, they've even gotten a little flippant in some of their language, specifically because around 2017, and we'll get into this, the government, the Pentagon, the administration, started classifying pretty much every single metric that would tell us how the war is going as it relates to security, like Taliban attacks, and the progress and abilities of the Afghan local security forces and their equipment, which is particularly important because we are being told, a la Vietnamization Nixon, that the Afghan local security forces are the future, right? That's the key to our strategy. But we've gone ahead and we've, sort of classified, made secret all those things. So the public's not even allowed to know any longer how the war is going. And of course, that's the most undemocratic thing I've ever heard. It's absurd, actually. It's worthy of Camus absurdity. But the most interesting thing about this latest report, and then we can go whatever direction you want, is that for the first time, because of COVID and now all those medical recommendations, they're not even publishing a classified version. So that means that almost everyone in Congress, the people that supposedly represent you, aren't even able to see how the war is going. This is just of a piece with the Afghan war in general and the war on terror. I mean, this level of farce is it should be an alarm bell in the night. And I don't think anyone's reading these reports, Scott, except like, you and I.
Yeah, I honestly didn't even read this one, man. I've been so busy. I saw it showed up. And whoever it was at Cigar that put me on the email list, I really appreciate that. I'm not sure if just a stranger signed me up for it or they actually did it themselves. It's been a few years ago now. But anyway, no, I actually skipped this one. But, and this gets right into the heart of what you're writing about here in this story, is I wouldn't really mind if they have to do nothing but lie and cover up all the way out the door, right? In other words, if all the metrics being reported would mean X much more political pressure in D.C. to keep us there, then go ahead and cover it up. I don't care. Just end the goddamn war. That's all I care about. But then as I read your piece here, you don't seem to think that the deal reached with the Taliban will end the war at all.
Oh, no, that's the whole thing. So,
which I'm sorry, one more thing about that. The headline this week is that Trump is saying, forget the peace deal. I don't want to get out next May. I want to get out right now.
Yeah, and I mentioned that in my social media post about this. Hey, kudos, President Trump. It would actually be a first if he did that, right? For him and for any other president or figure. And I'm not even afraid to say that. Of course, I mean, people think I wear a MAGA hat when I write my articles these days, which is just ridiculous. But, if he means it, and I think his instincts are in that direction and always have been without much follow through so far, then let's do it. Because I actually think, and maybe I'm giving him too much credit, but I actually think that Trump knows that the peace deal, right, that he signed was a farce. I don't think he ever believed it was going to save the war or bring peace to Afghanistan. I think he knew that it was just, a way out, basically. So a surrender without saying it. Of course, he's never going to say that, neither is any president. But the reality is, if he really is ahead of timeline, like he says he is, although the Pentagon and the White House aren't sure how many soldiers are still in Afghanistan. One says there's about 9,000. One says there's about 7,000. Doesn't matter. If we're trying to get ahead of schedule, good. Let's do it. But so I think the peace deal is ridiculous, and it's got enough holes in it to keep the war going forever. But that's okay, because it's the only choice. I mean, the facts on the ground aren't going to change because we signed a treaty that lets the Taliban stay in the field, continue to attack. They're not even precluded from attacking. It says so in the report. Like, the State Department sent an email to Sagar saying, "Oh, actually, don't freak out about this. Not just Taliban attacks, but increase in Taliban attacks in March, because the deal doesn't actually say that they can't attack the Afghan security forces." So in other words, this is Vietnam all over again, right? Paris Peace Accords. We let the North Vietnamese army stay in South Vietnam, and they take the capital 2 years later. And I'm not going to predict when Kabul's going to fall or if it's going to. What I will say is that there's a lot of historical precedent that this war is only going to continue.
But in other words, what you're saying is the question is which war? The war between the U.S. and the Taliban might be over, but the war between the Taliban and the Kabul government is still going on. Is that what you're saying? And will still be going on. Yeah.
Exactly. And I don't have any problem with that, because I try to be clear-eyed about this. I don't think we can influence that or affect it. I don't think we ever truly could. Yeah. So I'm totally fine with it. I just want us to be honest about what the peace is.
Yeah, it's just like in my book. I mean, time to end the war in Afghanistan. I'm referring to our war there. I don't think we can end the war there just by leaving, but we can't end it by staying either. That's for sure.
America's history in Afghanistan has always been generally destabilizing, right? At least since 1979, probably 1973. So, I mean, the idea that we're going to have any major influence on the outcome after we leave is silly, which is why the tragedy that I point out is that whether we would have left in 2002, 2006, 2008, or you name the year, the outcome probably would have been basically the same. So I don't have a problem with Trump's concept. I just like clear language and being honest about it. I don't know, maybe I'm sentimental.
Yeah. But you do think that, well, I guess, so what I'm trying to get at here is loopholes in the actual deal. So if the loophole is that North and South Vietnam are going to keep fighting, that's one thing. But are there loopholes in here that are going to keep our troops there or not?
Well, not necessarily, but there is the potential for it. For example, Pompeo made a statement, and so did the State Department, saying, well, not only is the Taliban not precluded from continuing their attacks and staying armed, but, we're then not prohibited from fighting back. So we're allowed to bomb them if they attack the Afghan forces. So, yeah, there is a loophole that allows us to keep fighting, but the question is whether that's what the Trump administration wants. I like to think, especially of late, that they don't want that they are ready to cut and run. Yeah, they'll call it whatever they call it. But at this point, I'm so desperate that I don't really care what they call it. I mean, I'm going to write about it. I'm going to call for some version of honesty about it. But if they don't, and I don't expect they will be clear about it, then all right, let's just go. Let's just go, because at this point, I'll take what I can get, as cynical as that sounds.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, well, what the hell? That doesn't sound that cynical. I mean, you're talking about the level of destruction being wreaked on these people by U.S. forces to this day, as well as, all the American troops still going in and out of there and all of the rest of this. I'll take half a loaf on this if it means the war there keeps going on. That's a shame, but it's certainly the right thing to get out here. And I guess the greatest thing I ever heard in my life was that this president thinks he needs this win for his reelection. And by win, that is acceptance of total failure. He's willing to go ahead, and he has calculated, apparently, from the trial balloons in the press and all this stuff, he has calculated that if he tells the American people, I'm the president that ended the Afghan war, even in failure, that the American people will vote for that. And it makes me think I need to start writing a bunch of books called Time to Do This and Time to Do That, because apparently I'm pretty good at making things come true with my subtitles.
But yeah, Scott, I blame you. I think you caused this pivot. but you actually make a good point. I mean, your book was important, and it's interesting how this is sort of Trump's calculation now, which I like, is the inverse of what happened in Vietnam and Afghanistan up to now. Because as you know, the argument was always I don't want to be the president that lost Vietnam. I don't want to be the president that lost Afghanistan. So there was always this inertia to stay, because you didn't want to leave and then have the bloodshed that follows. And then everyone says, oh, you lost China, going back to 1949. But I think Trump has demonstrated that, we're so through the looking glass that at this point, the American people are pretty much okay with admission of defeat, and hey, if he does it, then he deserves to be applauded. And it doesn't matter how much I loathe him. I think that intellectual honesty and ethical honesty demands that we applaud whatever he does to get us out of this place.
Right.
If he does it.
Well, it's also perfect political judo against the Democrats. Go ahead, Biden, attack me and say that, no, we have to leave 20,000 troops to fight a counterterrorism campaign forever. Go ahead.
I got to say, I mean, you're right. It actually, because I'm so sick of the Democrats, and just as much as I hate Trump, I would find it almost amusing to watch him, and I think he'll do it, place the Democrats in a position where they have to defend the forever wars. Because he kind of did that in 2016, and I think he's going to do it in 2020, and it's going to be really fun watching Biden's, intellectual and ethical gymnastics trying to defend these wars. It's ridiculous, but it's going to happen most likely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and the thing is, time is sort of running short, but if he would, develop this thought a little bit further, maybe this could be an article for you, hey, Mr. Tall, fantastic, wealthy, successful Trump, here's a thing for you that, how you think we'd like it if you ended the war in Afghanistan? You're right. Same goes for Somalia and Syria and Iraq and especially Yemen. Think of all the wars you could end between now and November. You want to get reelected. You want to be Trump the Great. Go ahead and call off the entire project and then just do nothing but scapegoat Bush and Obama for ruining everything. And after all, it's true, right? It's
Absolutely.
Not like, I mean, it is his fault he should have done this in 2017, but still, he can still just say, look, this is all idiot Bush and weakling Obama's fault, and so we're calling the whole thing off.
I mean, I have this image in my head. It's almost like a fantasy. It's a dark one because it'll get him reelected, and I don't necessarily want that. But if he was truly brilliant, like, he would fly to Yemen tomorrow, make a speech against the Saudis, and hold a brown, skinny Yemeni kid and give it a kiss. If he did that, I mean, just imagine. All the talk about how he's anti-immigrant, all this is true, right? But I mean, it would be a coup. What would the Democrats do with that?
And blame the whole thing on Obama and Biden's administration for starting the war.
I mean,
he's guilty as hell, but he's also Donald Trump, so he's just Mr. Flip-a-Floppa. He could just pretend it's still all Obama and Biden's fault and not his, and probably get away with that. And I'd probably let him if he was actually ending the damn thing. Again, go ahead and lie. Just stop the bombing.
Yeah, that's where we're at right now. I mean, and how is Obama going to look from, Martha's Vineyard or whatever when, if Trump were to stand in a Yemeni refugee camp? I don't know if it's going to happen, but if he's listening, it would be the most brilliant and almost, it would be a brilliant political move. And if it ended the bombing, it would also be probably the most humanitarian thing done by a U.S. president in quite some time. And all of this, by the way, I realize is crazy that we're even talking about Trump in this way, but hey, the opportunity is there and he could seize it. And if he did, and it was in the interest of humanity, I guess I'll be a little utilitarian on this one.
Yeah, no, and look, he doesn't know the first thing about humanity. He doesn't care about that. We're talking about good politics. This is good politics because this is what the American people want. And forget a Yemeni refugee camp. Stand in the Rose Garden and just announce that we're no longer backing Saudi's war in Yemen. That's it. And not only that, we're sending them wheat to eat. I mean, what the hell? Why not? And especially, again, it's all just in his own selfish interests. It's not like this has anything to do with Donald Trump caring about anyone but himself or anything like that. But just if he wants to hold on to the power, it would be nice if he would start to restrain himself on this issue particularly. And everybody feels this way. And especially after the virus. Who thinks that, oh, yeah, no, we definitely should have spent the 21st century so far killing people in the Middle East, killing 2 million people for $6 trillion. That was definitely a great investment. Nobody believes that. You can't even get the guys at the National Review to support this thing anymore, Well, some of them.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, you're seeing a sort of, not a rebellion, but you're seeing a lot of wavering within the military ranks. I mean, definitely the mid-level and even some of the high-level folks, from what I'm hearing and also what I'm reading, no one believes in victory anymore. No one really thinks that this has been a good investment. And I'm talking about even most of the generals. Now, they will play along because they're company men and they want their jobs and all that. And most of them are monsters. But there's a lot of rumblings. And that's really pretty instructive, isn't it, at this point? Shows where we're at.
Yep. And again, the polls, the veterans, it's amazing that the American people say we never should have fought the wars in Afghanistan or Iraq. Which, hey, at least Osama was in Afghanistan. I mean, we all know they could have negotiated for him and all that. But you would think the American people would say, well, yeah, we had to do that or something. But no, super majorities of Americans say we never should have fought Afghanistan or Iraq. And then, amazingly, the veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq, their numbers are even higher than the general public's by a few points consistently now. When it comes to saying we never should have fought these wars at all. Not even should we end them now. But we wish we could take back the 21st century so far. Wow.
This is actually an extraordinarily remarkable thing, as much Trumpy and hyperbole as that is. I was doing just a very vague research, and I need to look further into it before I write it in an article. But my understanding is that the rates of troops and dependence of those troops, families that are against these wars that you mentioned, is higher even than at the end of the Vietnam War. I mean, that's pretty darn remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and, it's pretty easy to see why, right? I mean, take you, for example. You fought in Iraq. Now you're in the U.S., and you're figuratively looking across the ocean back at Iraq and what's happened there since then. And what are you supposed to think? Yeah, we sure did a great job over there, or what, I mean, and so that's you
absolutely.
And everybody else who fought over there with you too,
And I've seen a huge sea change, and not to personalize it, but just in an anecdotal way. When I started this game and wrote the book in 2014 and my first articles, I used to get massive hate mail from veterans and from serving members. I would say now it's 5-6 to 1 positive from vets and military folks, and it used to be probably 3 to 1 against. And that's a big deal, because we're only talking about 4 or 5 years. Something is afoot. And hey, if the people trust American soldiers, now that I don't think that we should be trusted just because of that. I think that's obscene. But it's the reality. Hey, if people trust the American troops and 7 out of 10 plus their families are against this, then hey, be vocal, because maybe it'll have some influence.
Yeah. And after all, I mean, it's pretty much undeniable, right? That it's not supporting the troops to support a war that they shouldn't be in, where they're risking their life and limb for a reason that's less than a perfect one, right? And so all the people who said support the troops, oppose the war back then, obviously were right. That you guys would have all been a lot better, marching around at Fort Bliss doing nothing than over there getting your limbs blown off for nothing,
Hey, Scott, I think you just gave me the idea for maybe my next article, which is, I'd call it something like chicken hawk extremists. And the point would be that, is there any better definition of a chicken hawk than being for wars that even 7 out of 10 of the troops against? I don't know that we've ever been in a situation like that in American history.
Yep.
I don't know that we've ever had those statistics, even in a draftee army in Vietnam. I don't know if we ever reached that point. I'll look into it. But I mean, that to me is the logical extreme conclusion of chicken hawkedness, right? It has to be.
Hey, y'all, check it out. The Libertarian Institute, that's me and my friends, have published 3 great books this year. First is No Quarter, The Ravings of William Norman Grigg. He was the best one of us. Now he's gone, but this great collection is a truly fitting legacy for his fight for freedom. I know you'll love it. Then there's Coming to Palestine by the great Sheldon Richman. It's a collection of 40 important essays he's written over the years about the truth behind the Israel-Palestine conflict. You'll learn so much and highly value this definitive libertarian take on the dispossession of the Palestinians and the reality of their brutal occupation. And last but not least is the great Ron Paul, The Scott Horton Show Interviews, 2004 through 2019. Interview transcripts of all of my interviews of the good doctor over the years on all the wars, money, taxes, the police state, and more. So how do you like that? Pretty good, right? Find them all at libertarianinstitute.org/books. Hey, you guys may know I'm involved in some Libertarian Party politics this year, but you can't hear or read about that at the Libertarian Institute due to 501c3 rules and such. So make sure to sign up for the interviews feed at scotthorton.org and keep an eye on my blog at scotthorton.org/stress. Hey y'all, Scott here. If you want a real education in history and economics, you should check out Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Tom and a really great group of professors and experts have put together an entire education of everything they didn't teach you in school but should have. Follow through from the link in the margin at scotthorton.org for Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Yeah, anyway, so let's get to your Soviet Union comparison here, since we're talking about collapsing empires in Afghanistan and everything here, Danny. You really have some great research here about the war in Afghanistan from the point of view of the Soviet Union and, in fact, internal Soviet politics in Moscow at the time. So, and then the comparison parallels to the Obama and Trump administrations here with Gorbachev in the 1980s.
Yeah, I think there are really important parallels. I don't pretend that I'm the best writer in town, but I probably read more than most writers. And so there's a lot of times that I'll be reading something and then I jot down like, oh my God, I got to write about this. And so I was reading some extensive stuff on the internal Soviet Cold War. And I found all these declassified, sort of documents that have now been published, like speeches Gorbachev gave and some statistics from the Soviet war effort. And what struck me was in two particular ways, and kind of three, there are enormous parallels. So Gorbachev comes in 85. He's elected on a very almost Obamian platform, at least for the Soviet Union. He's going to focus on domestic reform. He's kind of against these third world crusades, right? He doesn't run, but that's what he kind of comes to power on. And then his initial move is to actually sort of surge in Afghanistan, which falls on its face. And part of that surge, and this is a little bit more Trumpian, although also Obama, but Trump took it even further, is, when that doesn't work, when he doesn't see the progress with his, Afghan proxies that he was hoping for, when the surge didn't create the space and time for the security for political reconciliation. I mean, they use almost the exact same words as Obama and Petraeus did in Iraq and Afghanistan surges. Yeah. I mean, it actually was disturbing. Like, it made me sad how similar it was, because I was like, man, if folks read books, that would have helped. Policymakers. So then when that didn't work out so well, he's like, well, what we'll do is we'll just increase our cross-border artillery barrages, which we can't do, obviously, because we're not touching Afghanistan, but airstrikes as well. And so, that didn't work either, right? And it just increased the ire internationally, and then, of course, with the local proxies. And then the final thing that really struck me was that when the Soviets finally decided to leave, they did it sort of unilaterally. I mean, they sort of abandoned their people on the ground, and it's because Gorbachev realized the surge didn't work, the bombing didn't work, it's time to go. This government in Kabul is not considered legitimate, just like the one we have now largely isn't. And but to his credit, and I don't know if Trump has had this conversation, but to his credit, he had a conversation with Babrak Kemal, who eventually was the president of Afghanistan, had to be replaced because he didn't play ball. And he basically says, you're on your own. We'll support you with arms, but that's it. You've got to reach out to the Mujahideen. You've got to make peace and broaden your coalition, or you're going down. And he was pretty honest about that. And that was February of 87. So it's just about 2 years before he finally leaves. I don't know if Trump's had that exact conversation with Ashraf Ghani or whoever they decide is president, although they did just make a power sharing deal. But it's remarkably similar. It is disturbing. It's actually tragic to read. And then, as I say in the article, Gorbachev eventually sort of speaks at a Politburo meeting where he says, like, what did all these kids die for? I mean, he feels hopeless, and he's torn because he's like, oh, if we leave, we're going to look weak. And, same language we use today. But deep down, he's like, what in the world did these kids die for? And how are you going to explain it to the Soviet people? And this is the Soviet Union, right? This is supposed to be like total totalitarian state, right? They don't,
and this quote,
they don't
you're
care
saying,
what the people think.
This quote is when he's justifying staying, right? This isn't him saying, lamenting on the way out the door. This is him saying, we can't give up now because of the sunk cost fallacy of the guys we already got killed. Is that correct?
That's right, and it's actually a little bit crazier because of it, because the way it's described, so it's the transcript exists, but then it's also described by other folks in the meeting, and they described him as like exasperated and desperate, like that he was just torn. And so he's saying, yeah, we can't leave because how are we going to explain to people that we left? But then he also was emotionally invested in the idea that, geez, like he knew it was wrong, sort of like he knew it wasn't working. And so he's got this cognitive dissonance that I think you saw in pretty much all of the American presidents and policymakers so far. And frankly, if I would have, played a little trick on the reader, and just put Trump or Obama in some of these speeches, particularly Obama, I don't think that most folks would have ever thought that, believed it wasn't Obama. I mean, it's that similar, and the language is almost stolen. And yet we know for a fact that, they didn't plagiarize it. We know that even Obama, who's like an intelligent guy, wasn't really studying this kind of level of Soviet domestic, effects on the Afghan war. So they came up with these things independently. And to me, that's almost even more instructive and disturbing because they're so
Right.
similar.
Yeah, exactly. This is what'll happen to the French when they try to take over Afghanistan in 2152 as well, It's going to play out
Or
the
the
exact
Chinese,
same way.
yeah, right. Or the Chinese, although I think the
Yeah.
Chinese are smart enough to do it mostly like economically and all that. But yeah, it'll happen to the next empire too, in Afghanistan or elsewhere. Afghanistan is just like an extreme example of like graveyard of empires, and I know that gets thrown around. I know how many books and articles are titled around it, and I hate platitudes, but like, what do you do when the platitude is true?
Yeah.
What do you
it's
do
just the
with
geography,
the platitude
isn't it?
when it's demonstrably true?
I mean, it seemed to me that this was always a matter of geography. I mean, I remember arguing in 2001 that, listen, this country's the size of Texas. It's completely landlocked behind mountains. And it's, all mountains and deserts and badlands and a population with an ancient warrior culture. And so, right, like, all these things mean that you cannot take this place over no matter who you are. Unless you're just going to drop H-bombs and kill them all. Come back in 20 years when the radiation dies away. Something like that. But otherwise...
Oh, yeah.
I mean, what are you supposed to do about it?
I know we're getting tight on time, but if I could just like quickly say, like, just from an anecdotal, but I think also illustrative perspective, like, talk about geography. I was in the Arghandab Valley, right? One of the most dangerous places in Afghanistan for the Russians and for us, right? We were proud that we pushed further south than the Soviets. Like, we were proud of that, my battalion. I was like, that's the most absurd thing to be proud of.
Yeah,
but,
back when you had switched sides in the war and were
right.
fighting the war the Russians had fought. Anyway, go ahead.
So then directly to so the American army thought that the way to win this war was to be near the population center. So we dropped ourselves in the middle of this valley that's fairly fertile. Literally just to the north of the main road, Highway 1, there's mountains that are like impenetrable. Literally just to the south, and we're talking a matter of a few miles of me, is the Reg Desert. And on the other side of the Reg Desert is Pakistan. And so think about it like from the Taliban's perspective. They've got complete safe haven in either direction. Oh, by the way, west towards Maywand is also pretty desert. So like in three directions, they have complete safe haven. They could hit and run at any time. And we're kind of like trapped in the valley like rats. And then we're like, look, we're winning because we're doing population-centric coin because we're here. And it's inverted, though. It was an inverted strategy because we were actually the sitting ducks. And so the idea is that even on a micro level, in like one valley that happened to be a nightmare where like literally hundreds of Americans have died, it just speaks to the macro of Afghan geography and failed imperial strategy. It's staggering when I think about it, actually, looking back.
Yeah. All right. But so let me devil's advocate you one more on the way out the door here, which is this is where the name Fool's Errand came from for the book, was an interview with Daniel Davis. And where I asked him, okay, but what if instead of the ridiculous fool David Petraeus, what if there had been a competent general? And what if instead of having 140,000 troops, including NATO there, what if he had had 300,000, like in the high-end estimates? And so what if he had more troops? And what if instead of an 18-month ridiculous timeline, what if he had essentially an indefinite timeline, a good 10 years? For a competent general to see through the counterinsurgency strategy. And then, I had asked Lieutenant Colonel Davis, so might that have worked, or it still would have been a fool's errand? And he said, yeah, it still would have been a fool's errand. But I wonder whether, maybe that's too pessimistic. And maybe the Hawks are right that Obama just didn't. And, okay, maybe the Hawks are right that Bush should have never diverted all those resources away from Afghanistan to Iraq, and that then when Obama put those resources back in Afghanistan, he shouldn't have put them on such a short timetable. That's what all the Hawks say.
I'm with Danny on this, Danny Davis, but I will say this. The Soviets never tried 300,000. They topped out at about 120. And Gorbachev's surge, like Obama's surge, was time limited, and it announced that it would be. In fact, his was 12 months versus 18 months. So here's what I think the best case would have been. If you flooded the place with 300,000 soldiers, people like me on the ground could have made more of a security difference. But even still, it would have been short term. And let me say why. Two things. Number one, flooding the place with troops has the effect on legitimacy of looking even more like an imperial invasion. And we know that the Afghan people don't even like the presence. They're like the most libertarian people ever, right? In a way, like, except for their religion thing. They don't even want the Kabul government down there, right? So the American foreigners, I probably would have raised the iron. Now, we might have won militarily, right, for on the ground, and we might have been able to keep security. But I think the bigger thing is also geography and also diplomacy. Until we destroyed the safe haven of Pakistan, maybe Iran, although much less so, you name it, the reality is, it doesn't really matter how many soldiers we had on the ground. Like I said, we probably, if we stayed 10 more years with a surge of 300,000, I am confident that we would have kept attacks probably almost to a minimum. But it's a wait and see. And the question is, how long is wait and see? And I do not think you can ever overcome the historical block against the ability of foreign occupying troops to impose government at the tip of a bayonet. It tends to always be temporary, and an example of when it was tried with lots of troops is like Napoleon in Spain. And of course, he couldn't stay forever, but he did stay 5 years with hundreds of thousands of folks, right? And it didn't ultimately pan out. And I understand that the limits of historical analogy, but still, I think that there's something there. So there's a legitimacy problem and there's a safe haven problem, and I don't see us being able to overcome either of those.
What was the maximum number of troops deployed in South Vietnam?
Yeah, we got up to about 550,000 soldiers in August, I believe, of 1969. So like around the time we're Hamburger Hilling it up, in the A Shaw Valley, there's about 550,000 soldiers there on the ground in early Nixon administration. And that's another great example and a more relevant and recent one. It ultimately didn't affect the major problem, which was the North Vietnamese safe haven and sort of the lack of international and local legitimacy. So, Australia and South Vietnam sent some folks to help out. But do you think NATO was going to, kick in the requisite, 90 or 120,000? No, of course not. And were we really going to question the Pakistani safe haven in any real way? Well, probably not. And the whole thing is a mess. Look, South Vietnam had a lot of the same problems as Afghanistan, except there's one major difference. Afghanistan's almost worse because South Vietnam, at least on one side, there's an ocean. In Afghanistan, you don't even have that. You got, deserts in Pakistan and you name it. I mean, I was put in an impossible situation. It's not woe is me. It's just looking back with a little bit more strategic knowledge, having read your book and others, and dozens of others, it becomes apparent that it's actually shocking what we allowed to happen to us as soldiers and then also just as an American people, right? It's really staggering.
It is. And, the thing about it is, too, is the counterfactual is just right there. Not the counterfactual, but the hypothetical thing where you just put the shoe on the other foot and say, what if a Pashtun army tried to invade and pacify the population of Texas? It would be hilarious watching the Texans shoot them all to death for daring to try. Give me a break. Not in 1 million years. So why should it be the other way around?
I swear, like, sometimes Patrick Swayze movies from the 80s have like strategic relevance. It's the Red Dawn effect is what I would call it, right? Yeah. It wouldn't play out. And there's another connection here. Look at the protests at the state houses and lots of other stuff in American history. I don't know, Eamon Bundy and all this. There's a lot of stuff like Afghanistan, maybe slightly less extreme, but like Afghanistan, our people are very well armed, and lots of parts of America don't particularly love the federal government. That has enormous parallels to the situation in Afghanistan. It does. And technology and roads and internet hasn't changed that. There's still a distrust of the federal government here, and in Afghanistan, it's taken to extremists.
Yeah. And same thing with the terrain, too. Try to take Colorado from the Americans and see how well that works out when they already have the mountaintops and they're shooting down at you, no matter who you are. If they sent every last Chinaman over here, oh, you're not supposed to say that. If they, whatever, if they send
Listen,
if they conscripted the whole population of China, they couldn't take Colorado from the Americans ever.
Hey, look, and we've talked about it a lot of times. I think the Waco effect is important too. All right. So you got the distrust of the federal government. You got the religious component. Look, Afghanistan has all of that. And look how that turned out, right?
Yep.
Did they win? I don't know. A couple of years later in Oklahoma City, I bet you can make a lot of parallels to some of the bombings in Kabul that really derived from the rural parts of Kandahar.
Yeah. Although, unless you just mean because both of those bombings, Waco and Oklahoma, were both perpetrated by the government. But no, I know what you mean. Yeah, that's a whole other story, man.
Right? Yeah, that could be a whole bunch of episodes, I bet. But I just think that your point is really important, and the Red Dawn effect is real. And of course, that's the movie where like the Russians and then Soviets and whatever Nicaraguans come to the United States and we fight them off. But I mean, it's real, and it proves that Afghanistan was just it was a fool's errand, Scott. Right? I don't know. I think you came up with that.
Yeah, sorry to say. You know what? Too. I think maybe, just maybe, out of all of them, this one may be really wrapping up now. What do you think? Think this really might be the first one to end?
Yeah, hopeful and cautiously optimistic is where I'd put myself. I really do try when the facts change to admit them. It's easy to bang like an anti-war drum sometimes, or a progressive drum, or whatever you have, and then like not see when there is progress, because you kind of get used to liking how dark and terrible everything is because it gives you a platform. But I actually try to, as best I can, alter my views when the facts change. So, I'm not sure that Trump's going to end it, but I think there's a better chance in this moment than there's probably ever been in the last 18 and a half years.
Yeah. Well, and so speaking of which too, there's a distinct lack of political rallies and all these things going around. So one way or the other, people have to let the White House know and let the Trump campaign know that there's some talking points we like to hear. Say that some more. Do that some more. Oppose the war in Afghanistan. We like that, and let them hear that feedback and know that they were right to think, he was right to think that the American people would hastily ratify his decision to get us the hell out of there if we could,
It isn't. This guy needs a lot of positive reinforcement.
He really does.
Like as a person, and I think we should give it to him when it's appropriate. The group BringOurTroopsHome.us, they came out of the Mountain West. You've heard me write about them. They're libertarians. They're Republicans. So, they admit themselves as Republicans, and they've been doing a lot of great work on their social media and in their congressional work on saying, "Hey, Mr. Trump, great job," and not all of them love Trump. I mean, a lot of them don't. But they're not afraid to praise him when it's appropriate, and I think that turns off most of the other anti-war groups, because I have noticed that I'm the only guy who straddles Veterans for Peace and Bring Our Troops Home. I'm sure there's a couple others, but I'm the only one I know, and I think it shouldn't turn off the lefty anti-war groups. I think that they should understand that this is a tactical move, and we need all the allies we can get.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, it always should have been the case. This has driven me crazy all along and this even happened at the last big anti-war protest over Iran. They literally, you can't make this stuff up. They actually brought Jane Fonda out to headline and give a big speech at the one in LA, which is just, it shows just absolutely no imagination whatsoever for trying to persuade anyone, for even thinking, even considering about who their audience is, that you're going to take the poster child, which is totally unfair what they've done to her, but it is what it is. You can take this total hate figure and put her up there, when what they should be doing is bringing up Thomas Massey, or bringing up somebody who from Bring Our Troops Home, who leans right, and then say, look, even these right-wingers agree with us. That's how right we are. It's the perfect talking point. You have to pretend as leftists that libertarian and right-wing anti-war sentiment doesn't exist. Why not invoke it to say, this is proof that we are the most brilliant geniuses in the world, that even these libertarians and conservatives agree with us? That should be all you have to do,
Absolutely. Look, even if you are completely sympathetic to their arguments, and I often am, there is a strategic calculus, right? And the left is inept, and you are inept if you think that bringing out Michael Moore or Jane Fonda is going to even if they're right, if you think that's going to convince a single person who's not ready convinced, then what you are doing is you are like you're so insular and so self-important and self-righteous. That's what you're being if you think that that's going to have an influence, because it's not. It isn't. And you're right. Someone like Thomas Massey, you can like if I disagree with him on a whole bunch of stuff, but he's the bravest voice a lot of times on some of these issues, then I've got to be willing to say that, even if I'm not a Republican, even if I'm not, with him on everything. Like this is strategy. This is street strategy, and let's do it right. Let's be smart.
Yep. And that's the whole thing, right? Is like the more you disagree with him, the better, for that matter, right? It just proves that this is a bipartisan consensus because it's the truth. Everyone in D.C. wants war. Everyone who's not in D.C. doesn't. That's the divide. It's not left versus right, Republican versus Democrat. It's the people versus the power, period. And that shouldn't, left-wingers or right-wingers or whoever shouldn't be afraid of sharing their thunder with the other side when the other side only makes your thunder louder. It only makes it more important. It only proves that you're right. You shouldn't hesitate to share the attention or whatever it is. But anyway.
Well, I wrote that article for Anti-War about when I went to D.C. for like the big conference for Bring Our Troops Home. And, one of the things I wrote about was like, this guy, Tyler Lindholm from like Idaho, he's like literally got a huge belt buckle and a big ass cowboy hat. And he's like one of our lead spokesmen. And he's a long-term conservative. And like, if a lot of folks that I know who I love to death from other anti-war organizations on the left had been there, they probably would have walked out when they saw him. But I looked at him and I was like, this is awesome. This is awesome that this veteran in a huge cowboy hat from Idaho is in D.C. to say no more war. That's the greatest thing I saw all year.
Right. And yeah, why should the Veterans for Peace people be against that? In fact, as long as we're at it, why should the Veterans for Peace people put "we're leftists" as their highest, messaging, when their messaging is supposed to be "we're veterans for peace"? Instead, it's like, what is this about? Trying to recruit people for your workers' union that doesn't even really exist anyway? Or some fantasy of a future socialist America? Or you're trying to actually end the wars? Because if this is actually a issue-based thing, why would you put Tom Morello on your board of directors instead of anti-war veterans? You have the guitarist, the Stalinist from Rage Against the Machine up there saying, oh yeah, if you hate war, you hate America, because everybody knows those things go together. Let's go sell that. I know, we'll bring Jane Fonda and have her headline. It's completely just head-up ass thinking. I don't know. Seriously. And I like leftists. I could put myself in their shoes and go, yeah, I'm a leftist. Okay, fine. Why does that mean that you put put the guy from Rage Against the Machine on the head of your Veterans for Peace committee? It makes no sense unless it's just a self-referential thing, like a power bubble like you would have in D.C. of people agreeing with each other but not thinking anything through.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a member of Veterans for Peace. I go to their, I keynoted a speech at one of their conventions. I'm going to continue to be a member, but I've also, even in my speeches in front of these folks, pointed out some of the major flaws in the organization and some of the reasons why. And some folks in the leadership know this, some of the younger folks, but the potential that like they could almost die out, right? Because so many of them are sort of like leftovers of the Vietnam generation. Great, I love them to death. But some of their positioning is actually affecting their recruitment. And so that's why I think you're seeing the younger veterans. It's a crisis, by the way, for Veterans Peace, like recruiting younger people. So you see them going in the libertarian direction to bring our troops home, or you see them going to like About Face and, which used to be Iraq Veterans Against the War on the left. And so the young generation is not really like all about the traditional like Vietnam Jane Fonda rhetoric, even if they agree with it, right? They go in one of those other two directions. And so it is a crisis for that organization.
And it's really too bad because it's a huge group. I mean, they got chapters all over the country. As you say, they're created in the 80s, but they're essentially made up of all Vietnam era guys. And so there's a huge, background and infrastructure there. And it's a shame to see them just kind of, sacrifice their potential power and influence there. And by the way, I love Rage Against the Machine, but I'm just saying, it's just a bad look. Why do it that way? When tearing down the whole system is not the point of this group, right? You can have other groups that are for that, but this is supposed to just be guys who've been to the war and so now know better. That's a really important message. That's the message that you bring, right? That's, and I love your writing, but your writing is twice as important as it would be because you've been to both surges and back. And so that is, the credibility that they're essentially sacrificing for no good reason, it seems like to me, unfortunately, not to be too critical, because there are a lot of great guys there. Yeah. I'm not trying to.
Garrett Reppenhagen is up there. He's a former sniper from like the post 9/11 wars, and he's a friend, and I think from everything I can tell that he's trying to go in a more inclusive direction, and also for the youth. But there's obviously a ways to go. I always joke whenever I speak at VFP rallies, like whether they're regional or national, I always say like, I love you guys, but I don't love the fact that I'm the youngest person in this room, and it gets a good like chuckle, but I'm like, nope, I'm dead serious,
Right. Yep. Well, anyway, so I'm sorry I can't end on a positive note there. I was just sitting here complaining about these groups, but yeah, no, all these guys, they're doing a lot of work. They're really doing great work, and so I don't want to just slam them, but it's supposed to be constructive criticism, not just complaining here. But anyway, so I just want to thank you again for all your great work, Danny. I mean, it's absolutely indispensable stuff, as always.
Thanks, Scott. I'm always glad to be on the show, and anywar.com. It's the place, man. You guys are one of the only outlets. You don't change my titles. You barely change anything. You let me be free, and you don't tell me what to write. It's awesome, and it's rare because the media space, man, it's a lot of contrived stuff going on, as you all know.
Yep. Well, we're very happy to have you. I speak for all the rest of us too. So hell yeah. Thanks.
All right. Well, thanks for having me, and let's do it again soon.
Absolutely. All right, you guys. That's the great Danny Sjursen. He was a major in the U.S. Army. Now he's an anti-war guy. Here he is at antiwar.com. Cigar, the boys who cry about actual wolves. The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.